Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we focus on a new book by Aaron Bateman of the George Washington University entitled Weapons in Space, Technology, Politics, and the Rise and Fall of the Strategic Defense Initiative, published by MIT Press in May of 2024. A few quick things before we get going. As always, we like to recognize a key figure whose behind-the-scenes labors make these seminars possible, and that's Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center. Second, our next session takes place 1 week from today on Monday, October 7th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. In an AHA-sponsored event, we'll be discussing Mary Ellen Curtin's new book, She Changed the Nation, Barbara Jordan's Life and Legacy in Black Politics. We hope you can join us. Third, on the logistics front, today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on the seminar's YouTube page, where many dozens of past programs are archived. And then finally, when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function in Zoom. There's no need to delay. You can get on board at any point, and then we'll call on as many folks as we can. All right. Now, Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson Center will introduce our speaker and commentators and moderate discussion. Christian, over to you.
Thank you, Eric. Welcome, everyone. And it's wonderful to really welcome an all-star cast here this afternoon to discuss the international history of SDI. Aaron Bateman, Susan Colburn, and Anthony Eames. I'll introduce all of them in turn. And to start with our featured speaker today, Aaron Bateman is Assistant Professor of History and International Affairs at the George Washington University. Trained as a historian of science and technology, his interests lie at the nexus of science, technology, and international security. Specifically, Aaron's research investigates how science and technology have shaped foreign policy, nuclear strategy, alliance dynamics, and arms control. His scholarship has explored many of these themes through the lens of the space age during the Cold War, and he does so prominently in his book, Weapons in Space, Technology, Politics, and the Rise and Fall of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which we'll be discussing this afternoon. Aaron, welcome back to the Washington History Seminar. The Zoom room is all yours.
All right, thanks so much. So firstly, I want to thank both Christian and Eric for the invitation to be here. And I also really want to thank both Dr. Susie Colburn and Dr. Anthony Eames for taking the time to read the book and offer comments. And I really look forward to hearing their thoughts in a few moments. So my book, Weapons in Space, Technology, Politics, and the Rise and Fall of the Strategic Defense Initiative, traces the origins, evolution, and enduring consequences of SDI. And it's both a technological and diplomatic history of this really controversial missile defense program. Before jumping into the book's arguments, I just want to briefly discuss what exactly SDI was. SDI grew out of Ronald Reagan's March 1983 speech calling on American scientists to use their talents to render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. And SDI was really not one thing or one project, but rather an umbrella for multiple projects within the Department of Defense in the United States, dedicated to developing technologies to be able to shoot down incoming nuclear missiles using interceptors on land and in space. And the program was controversial due to its technological complexity and cost, as well as the reality that it would have violated the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and it would have also undermined the concept of mutually assured destruction. Moreover, the very idea of placing weapons in space was extremely controversial, due in no small part to the US government's public commitment since the 1950s to use space for peaceful purposes. So now I'd like to emphasize the book's historiographical contributions. Firstly, SDI, I argue, was a key part of a much broader transformation in superpower military competition in space that emerged as détente was crumbling in the 1970s. Much of the historiography of the space age still focuses on NASA and human space exploration, but I show in the book that key elements of SDI grew out of largely secret US efforts beginning in the 1970s to use space technologies to secure military advantages over the Soviet Union. Even before Reagan came into office, a more militarily competitive view of space had emerged in key corners of the US national security establishment. But these developments were highly classified, so SDI looked like a bolt out of the blue when in reality it was part of a much more gradual shift in the military use of space that was already underway. Secondly, SDI was an international program. By 1990, multiple countries, including Britain, West Germany, Italy, and Israel, were participating in SDI research and development due to their concerns about a widening technology gap with the United States. And the international character of SDI really underscores the fact that expanded militarization of space in this period transcends the bipolar superpower dynamic. Thirdly, SDI was a significant impediment to space arms control in the 1980s and early 1990s. And when we think about the history of arms control in this period, it's generally presented as a triumphant one because the superpowers agreed to unprecedented nuclear arms reductions. But we have to remember that the INF and START agreements grew out of this forum known as the Nuclear and Space Talks, and Moscow and Washington were not able to agree to do new limits on the military use of space at the same time that they were indeed able to agree to these unprecedented nuclear forces reductions. And then finally, SDI was reoriented towards more limited missile defense systems in the 1990s for both political and technological reasons. Numerous technical challenges combined with the changing international political environment after the collapse of the Soviet Union led to a significant reduction in congressional support for SDI. All that being said, the program is still with us today in a more limited form and managed by the Missile Defense Agency. And issues left unresolved in the space component of the nuclear and space talks continue to shape the international dialogue on space security today. So now I'd like to jump into where did SDI come from and specifically focusing on the space context of the program. So one of the accusations or one of the concerns and anxieties that came out in the 1980s is that SDI was leading to the militarization of space. In reality, space had been militarized since the launch of Sputnik in 1957. And the United States began using space for military purposes beginning in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And by the end of the 60s, the United States had deployed satellites used for intelligence gathering, communications, navigation. And since reconnaissance satellites in particular constituted the largest source of American intelligence on the Soviet Union, the US government was really cautious not to take any action in space that might provoke Moscow to act aggressively against US satellites. So publicly, the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations emphasized that the United States was committed to the peaceful use of outer space, which didn't preclude the development of military capabilities, but really the US was generally restrained, certainly not developing space-based weaponry of any kind. And the US government downplayed its military activities in space, making NASA and the civil space program the face of American space activities. In the 1960s, there's really few treaties governing military activities in space. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty prohibited the deployment of nuclear weapons in space, but not non-nuclear weapons. The 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty prohibited the deployment of missile defense interceptors in space. And interpretations of this latter agreement would become especially contentious in the 1980s in the context of SDI. So the situation begins to change somewhat in the mid-1970s as détente is experiencing some difficulties. And this change is really driven by both technological and political factors. The political factors being the deterioration of détente, but technologically in the 1970s, both the United States and the Soviet Union begin to use satellites in a different military role. They begin to use satellites to do things like enable precision targeting of adversary forces deep behind enemy lines. Also, because the United States was more dependent on satellites than the Soviet Union was testing an anti-satellite weapons capability designed to be able to shoot down US satellites in a wartime scenario. So in light of all of this, in 1976, President Gerald Ford commissions a highly classified study into the future uses of space, military uses of space, under the direction of Solomon Buxbaum, who had been a presidential science advisor. And basically, this study concluded that because space systems, because satellites were playing an increasingly important military role, the United States needed to develop weapons to be able to shoot down Soviet satellites in wartime. And so in Gerald Ford's final 48 hours in office, he initiated a new anti-satellite weapons program that would come to fruition in the Reagan administration that was specifically designed for this purpose. This study that led to this anti-satellite weapons program ultimately concluded that treating space as a sanctuary was against the US national interest, and basically stated that in a superpower conflict, war would extend into space with both superpowers shooting down each other's satellites, which also carried significant escalation risks. These events did not make SDI inevitable, but they form a key part of SDI's genealogy and the idea that space is going to play a much more important and direct military role for the United States. When President Jimmy Carter arrives in the White House, he takes a different approach. He pursues constraints on space weaponry. The United States and the Soviet Union go through multiple rounds of negotiations to limit anti-satellite weapons, but when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, those talks are derailed, and the space weapons issue is ultimately kicked into the next administration. So shortly after coming into the White House, Ronald Reagan stressed the need to reinvigorate American space leadership on the world stage. He made a speech emphasizing this point on July 4th, 1982 at Edwards Air Force Base in front of the space shuttle. And Reagan really believed that space held great economic potential, and he also believed that the United States had an opportunity to use its advantages in space technologies to secure significant advantages over the Soviet Union, military advantages. And Reagan really saw strategic defense or space-based missile defense as fitting into this kind of a construct. The president also believed that it would be possible to use these kinds of advanced technologies to shoot down incoming missiles as a potential way to move away from a strategy dependent on the threat of nuclear annihilation. The president also heavily criticized the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, believing that it had constrained US technological advantages. Concurrently, Reagan was increasingly concerned about Soviet research into missile defense, as well as the Soviet Union's military space program. After receiving a CIA briefing on the Soviet space program, the president wrote in his diary that the Soviets were working twice as hard as the United States to achieve superiority in space. So there's a number of different factors that lead to the establishment of SDI. And really lead to the president's decision to make his infamous March 1983 SDI speech. And it's in the fall of 1982, just months before that speech, that Reagan decides to pursue a strategic defense program. And he had asked the Joint Chiefs to look into the feasibility of strategic defenses, but it's really clear that the president had more or less made up his mind by this point that he wanted to pursue some kind of a strategic defense capability. And it's really important to stress that Reagan does not make this decision through consultation of the interagency. He doesn't ask for interagency studies and reviews about what the implications of strategic defense might be. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger and Secretary of State George Shultz learn of the president's plan to make this speech in March of '83, or rather to insert language about rendering nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete only days before the president's televised address. Now, when the president makes the speech, he doesn't say anything about space. He doesn't say anything about lasers. He doesn't really even talk about missile defense explicitly. And so no one really has a clear idea of what Reagan has in mind, other than the fact that he's talking about rendering nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. And it takes about a year for the SDI program to be formally established, so not until January of 1984. And the Pentagon creates a special organization called the Strategic Defense Initiative Organization that direct reports to the Secretary of Defense to manage all of these research and development efforts into advanced technologies with missile defense applications. The Soviet response to Reagan's March 1983 speech is overwhelmingly negative. Soviet leader Yuri Andropov condemned the president's speech. He warned that strategic defense would only lead to greater instability and believed that the United States might use SDI technologies to carry out a decapitating first strike against the Soviet Union. But I think what's really important for our purposes today is that Andropov emphasizes that there has to be constraints on space weaponry, anti-satellite weapons, and space-based missile defense to make any progress in arms control negotiations in the future. And there's a technological linkage between anti-satellite weapons and space-based missile defense. The same weapons that could be used to shoot down an incoming ballistic missile could also be used to shoot down a satellite. So if the United States agreed to constraints on space weapons, it would be indeed constraining its ability to deploy a missile defense system in the future. And this linkage really becomes a problem for Reagan, both in terms of public diplomacy on SDI, as well as in the arms control negotiations. At the same time, SDI really tests the cohesion of the transatlantic alliance even further. This is a very tense time in the transatlantic alliance as the United States is preparing to deploy intermediate range nuclear forces in Europe. And Reagan makes this speech without consulting any allies. And so Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, for example, is totally taken by surprise and doesn't even really have any idea of what Reagan intends to do and what a strategic defense initiative program might ultimately lead to. Both Britain and France, as nuclear powers in Europe, are concerned about what a missile defense buildup might mean for their relatively small nuclear deterrence. And so Reagan wants to get Allied solidarity behind the program. And so to garner support for the Allies, in March 1985, the United States invited 15 allies, predominantly NATO countries, but also Australia, Japan, Israel, and the Republic of Korea, to become involved in SDI. And the idea is that if we can give our allies potential access to advanced technologies through the SDI Research and Development Program, technologies with both civil and military applications, that perhaps some of their hostility towards SDI will be reduced. If we look at it from the Allies' perspectives, they're concerned about the implications of SDI for nuclear stability. They're worried about SDI leading to an arms race in space, but they also view SDI in industrial and economic terms. Britain and West Germany, for example, are concerned that SDI could widen the technology gap between the United States and its allies across the board. So the allies are put in this difficult position of how do we get involved in SDI to benefit from it technologically without necessarily endorsing Reagan's expansive vision for SDI. And by 1990, multiple countries, including the UK, West Germany, Israel, Italy, and Japan, would become formally involved in SDI R&D. But what we find is that it doesn't actually really reduce the hostility in the way that Reagan had anticipated. But nonetheless, their participation in the program really underscores that this intensifying militarization of space taking place in the 80s was indeed an international phenomenon. So there's a lot of changes that take place within the SDI program from about 1986 to 1988. So when Reagan makes his March 1983 speech, as I mentioned earlier, he doesn't actually talk about what space-based missile defense might look like or any other missile defense concepts that could grow out of SDI. And initially, there was a lot of discussion of these kind of futuristic missile defense technologies, such as space-based lasers that could very efficiently shoot down incoming missiles. And it's clear by 1986 that these kinds of technologies are not going to mature anytime soon, if at all. So Reagan wants to make near-term progress and demonstrate that SDI could produce feasible technologies. So the Pentagon begins focusing on using what are known as hit-to-kill technology. So this is, in effect, using the kinetic force of a missile impacting an incoming ballistic missile to destroy it. And it was literally called hitting a bullet with a bullet. And the idea was that if we use these technologies, that by the 1990s, perhaps we can actually deploy something. This creates an immediate problem, however. If Reagan is going to push forward with these near-term options for missile defense, perhaps in a decade or less away, it would, of course, be decided by his successor. But if you're going to lay the foundation for doing that, that's going to create immediate problems for the arms control dialogue that's being reinvigorated. If the United States wants to deploy missile defense interceptors in space, that's going to require going beyond the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. So with the US and the Soviet Union entering into a new series of arms control negotiations in the form of the nuclear and space talks, it's very clear now with Mikhail Gorbachev as the leader of the Soviet Union that the space component is still going to be a significant problem. And the Soviets still have this policy at this time that we can't make progress on nuclear arms reductions unless we first can agree to constraints on space-based missile defense and anti-satellite weapons. And this disagreement over missile defense really comes to a head at the Superpower Arms Control Summit in Reykjavik in 1986, when Gorbachev famously proposes eliminating all US and Soviet nuclear weapons if Reagan will agree to constraints on SDI, and Reagan refuses to confine SDI to the laboratory. Now, there's a lot of different aspects to why ultimately the Soviets de-link SDI from progress in nuclear arms reductions. But what I want to stress here is that Gorbachev unilaterally makes that decision to de-link SDI from negotiations on intermediate range nuclear forces, leading to the INF Treaty in 1987. And Gorbachev makes that decision because his advisors convince him, or at least one of the reasons why he makes that decision, is his advisors convince him that if the United States moves forward with deploying space-based defenses, the Soviet Union can pursue its own asymmetric countermeasures. That rather than a Soviet SDI equivalent, the Soviets could deploy things like more anti-satellite weapons to be able to shoot down SDI components from space in a wartime scenario. SDI doesn't bully the Soviets into delinkage. It's really the fact that as the United States is clarifying what a space-based missile defense system might look like, Gorbachev becomes convinced that the Soviets can indeed respond, but respond more cost-effectively. And despite the signing of INF, SDI would really remain a point of contention in US and Soviet negotiations over strategic nuclear weapons until the Soviets, in effect, de-link SDI from those negotiations in 1990, paving the way for the signing of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty in 1991. But even with these monumental nuclear arms control agreements, the US and the Soviet Union still cannot agree to any constraints on what the Soviet Union terms space strike arms, which would include both space-based missile defense interceptors and anti-satellite weapons. And the United States is really intransigent on SDI for a number of reasons. One, Reagan is totally committed to space-based missile defense. Even though George H.W. Bush wasn't quite as committed as Reagan, he still wants to push forward with space-based defenses. And also within the Department of Defense, there is significant resistance to any kind of space arms control because senior US leaders believe that this is indeed an area where the United States has an asymmetric advantage. So there would be no formal treaties limiting any kind of military activities in space coming out of the nuclear and space talks. So what happens to SDI? In the 1990s, SDI is in effect brought down to earth. With significant progress in arms control, with improvement in relations between Moscow and Washington, there is increasingly limited support for spending billions of dollars on space-based defense. Combined with that changing international political environment, there's 3 tests of SDI space-based interceptors in 1991 and 1992 that are failures, and that really undermines the SDI cause in Congress. After Bill Clinton comes into office in 1993, he cuts funding for space-based interceptors, focusing solely on land-based missile defense. And so this really reorients the United States towards a much more limited missile defense architecture and really leads to the modern missile defense architecture that we have today. One of the reasons why the space-based component of SDI is eliminated is because of the political controversy surrounding deploying weapons in space. The Russian Federation makes it clear that if the United States does indeed move forward with deploying space-based defenses, if the United States moves beyond the ABM treaty, that could lead to a pullout from these landmark arms control agreements that Washington and Moscow had signed. So there's significant political resistance to moving beyond the ABM treaty for those reasons. All that being said, SDI is often treated as something that disappears when Reagan departs from the White House, but the infrastructure for the program remains in place even though it's downgraded. The Strategic Defense Initiative Organization is renamed the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization in the Clinton administration to really distance SDI or distance U.S. missile defense research from Reagan and the whole SDI legacy. And then ultimately, the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization becomes the U.S. Missile Defense Agency. And it would be President George W. Bush in 2002 who would withdraw the United States from the ABM treaty and press forward with the deployment of more limited ground-based missile defenses in Alaska and California. I also want to stress, though, that there is significant connections between SDI and what we see happening currently in the U.S. Department of Defense in the context of military activities in space. The Strategic Defense Initiative Organization became the model for the U.S. Space Development Agency within the U.S. Space Force that is now moving forward with the deployment of a massive number of satellites to be able to track all kinds of missile threats cradle to grave, and is really reinvigorating certain aspects of the SDI program. And so even though Reagan's expansive vision of SDI does not come to fruition, it is still influencing the current missile defense and space architectures that the United States possesses. And just some concluding thoughts. SDI would not have emerged without Ronald Reagan. But from a space standpoint, if we look at the space context of the program, I really see the key transformative period as the decade prior to Reagan. And I want to stress again, these shifts in US thinking about space in the 1970s don't make SDI inevitable, but they really do lay an intellectual framework for thinking about space in a more militarily competitive way. Aside from the connections between SDI and the current Department of Defense bureaucracy for missile defense and for space, it's also important to emphasize that these different issues left unresolved in the superpower arms control negotiations concerning space continue to shape international discussions on stability in space today. And so in many ways, the ghost of SDI still haunts US, Russian, and Chinese discussions about the present and future of space security. And with that, I look forward to the comments from the discussants and also from the audience. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Lots on the table there, lots to discuss. We have two terrific discussants this afternoon. Professor Susan Colburn, who is the Associate Director of the Program in American Grand Strategy and now the Associate Research Professor at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. A diplomatic and international historian, she specializes in European security, the politics of nuclear weapons, and the history of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. She is the author of Euromissiles, the nuclear weapons that nearly destroyed NATO, published by Cornell in November 22, and I think launched in the Washington History Seminar in January 2023. Welcome back, Susie. It's always wonderful to see you, and we look forward to your comments.
Thanks so much, Christian, for the kind introduction, and thanks to the whole team at the American Historical Association and the History and Public Policy program at the Wilson Center. I love this series. It's always a pleasure to be a part of it, and I'm really glad to be here today to celebrate the release of Aaron's book. Aaron, congratulations. It's wonderful to see it out. I had the pleasure of reading the book before its publication, and so it's a wonderful full circle moment to be here with Aaron and with Anthony to talk about it. So I want to say a few words about Aaron's overall approach, and then I'm going to toss out a bunch of questions to kick off our conversation. But the macro point I want to make about this book and Aaron's work here is that it broadens the study of the Strategic Defense Initiative, and I mean that in so many different ways. Aaron takes the technological dimensions of the Strategic Defense Initiative seriously, and in so doing moves beyond often flat depictions of SDI that reduce it to a single system or idea, right? Aaron gives us a much fuller picture and appreciation of how complex and often competing the various technological research and development and bureaucratic arrangements were that made up SDI. He situates SDI in a broader context, and so puts it back into larger narratives about the military uses of space in the final decades of the Cold War, and does so in a way that fills in some of the spottier parts of our political and diplomatic histories on the late Cold War. He breaks out of a popular paradigm that tends to treat the Strategic Defense Initiative as a subject of study primarily in the context of US-Soviet relations and the incredible, often surprising transformations of the 1980s. A critical dimension of the book, which Aaron talked about briefly in his remarks here, deals with US interactions with its allies, particularly in Western Europe, over the program and the potential and pitfalls of European firms' participation in SDI research. And he also hints at further avenues of research dealing with Japanese and Israeli contracts and participation in the program that hopefully someone will take him up on and pursue further. And Aaron also considers a longer chronology, right? He's not confined to the sort of traditional years of focus between Reagan's March 1983 speech unveiling the proposal and Mikhail Gorbachev's decision in February 1987 to untie the package and decouple SDI from the arms control, the Soviet Union's arms control omnibus approach, and then to move forward with a separate agreement to restrict intermediate range nuclear forces. So for all of these reasons, Aaron is doing things that are bigger and changing the way we conceptualize the Strategic Defense Initiative. What this means, at least as I read Aaron's work, is that Aaron tells a story that has a number of overlapping but distinct arguments about SDI, its evolution, and its significance, all of which puncture some of the lingering myths about SDI as nothing more than an absurd or impossible fantasy. And Aaron flagged many of those for us today. I would add one more to Aaron's list, which I think is that Aaron's book is a very good reminder that perceived policy failures can matter a lot, and to resist the temptation to study only the successes of, say, the arms control space, that failure can have a lot to teach us about how and why things unfolded as they did. So with that said, I want to put a few questions on the table, and Aaron, you should feel free to take up whichever of these that are interesting to you or none of them. But I have a lot of things that I think are avenues that we could go in our conversation. So the first is that in your scene setting remarks today, you highlighted SDI as part of a larger transformation in US-Soviet competition in space. And I wonder if this transformation or identifying this transformation changes the way you, as a scholar working on the Cold War, understand or conceptualize the chronology of that conflict. Right, so I would push you and ask you to talk a little bit about where it fits with your understanding of détente and détente's place in the Cold War. Is it that this new phase of competition in space is a sign of détente's demise, so echoing a sort of standard line of argumentation in the scholarship on US foreign policy, that détente collapsed entirely in the late 1970s, or is it a more complex story than that, and space opens up new ways that we can conceptualize or understand détente and its interactions with the Cold War more broadly? The second bundle of questions is about the famous March 1983 speech and some process questions. I wonder how much you see the early confusion and rumor about what the Strategic Defense Initiative was or wasn't as a product of process, right? The management and handling of the lead up to that March 1983 speech, and then, of course, the substance of what was and wasn't said by Reagan in that address. And then if you think that that is a process component, to what extent that rollout shaped the program's future and or the way that we continue to understand or treat SDI as a topic of historical inquiry. Then my third bucket of questions is about the Reagan foreign policy and where SDI fits in the Reagan foreign policy. I suspect Anthony might have some questions along these lines too, just a hunch. And so in the book, right, you emphasize that SDI is not just a product of Reagan's nuclear abolitionism or his desire to break out of the nuclear dilemmas of the Cold War, stand up with the Soviet Union, and make the case that SDI was in fact central to Reagan's efforts to advance US interests with space technologies, and you focus on both economic and national security interests in the argument you put forward in the book. And so based on that, I wondered if in the process of researching and writing this book, your general impression or assessment of the Reagan foreign policy changed, and how you see SDI fitting in Reagan's foreign policy more broadly, whether that's as the president or as the manager of a somewhat unruly administration at times. Then I have two more questions that I'll toss out. So one is about the March 1985 offer. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about what you think it tells us about US approaches to alliance management to make that offer, but to do so 2 years after the program had already been, at least in theory, in existence and public knowledge. And then my last question is about the arms control dimensions, which is to ask you maybe if you could expand on your understanding of the thinking within the Reagan administration about space arms control, and why, given the potential obstacles and challenges you highlighted in your comments here today, the administration championed the umbrella approach that led to the nuclear and space talks in the first place. I have many more things we could talk about, but that's more than enough, so I'll leave it there. Aaron, it's a wonderful book. Anyone who is interested in SDI, you should read it. And I'm looking forward to hearing Anthony's comments and your thoughts on some of those questions. Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you, Susie. Aaron, why don't you go have a go at some of these questions, and then we'll turn to Anthony, who can then maybe push you further on some of them. Go ahead.
So I think I'll start with, how did the rollout shape the program's future? I think this is a really important question. There was no strategy for presenting SDI to the public. And I really want people to think about this for a moment. Reagan is calling for the largest scale shift in US defense strategy during the Cold War. And there is no significant thought given to, how do we present this to the public? How do we present this to the allies? At least not initially. And the problem that immediately emerges is that people are leaning on these kind of pop culture ideas about space and technology to make sense of SDI. And you also have different officials in the administration saying different things. So ultimately, the Reagan administration comes up with something called the SDI Bible, which is in effect, how do we present SDI to the public? And one of the key problems that emerges is that the White House emphasizes that SDI will enhance deterrence and it will promote stability, and really downplays the fact that there are offensive applications for SDI technologies. And those offensive applications really kind of undermine the peaceful image that Reagan is presenting. And Reagan personally is not really interested in those dimensions, but other officials in his administration are. And so that gets into another part of your question, which is kind of, where does this SDI and the management of SDI fit into Reagan's foreign policy, and also just the different complex dynamics within the White House? There was no consensus about SDI within the White House. There was no single SDI position. Reagan had his very expansive vision of SDI leading to a world without nuclear weapons, which pretty much no one in the administration really believed in. And then you had folks within the Department of Defense, particularly Caspar Weinberger, who was vehemently opposed to space arms control because, aside from the fact that he wasn't really a huge advocate of arms control in general, specifically believed that the United States needed to build up its military power in space. And then you have Secretary of State George Shultz, who really sees SDI as a bargaining chip. And these different factions are kind of battling it out to ultimately determine what is going to be the pathway forward. And one of the fairly recent archival revelations from the Fruition series was that at one point Reagan actually said to his advisors, let's have a space arms control agreement. let's agree with the Soviets to get rid of offensive space weapons and just allow the deployment of defensive space weapons. And his advisors say, in effect, well, Mr. President, that's not possible because they're one and the same. And so publicly, the administration's message is that we can't have space arms control because it's unverifiable. Internally, the position is if we do have space arms control, it's going to preclude us from deploying space-based defenses at some point in the future. And so that's really where this position comes from, that we're not going to accept any constraints on space technologies. And then one final piece on all of this, to answer the question about SDI and Reagan's foreign policy. I think it's also important to emphasize that Reagan saw SDI both in competitive and cooperative terms, and sometimes there was a bit of a contradictory message. He sincerely spoke about sharing SDI technologies with the Soviet Union to the chagrin of his senior advisors. But in other times, he talked about SDI as a necessary response to Soviet missile defense and military space programs. And it was also difficult to reconcile these somewhat competing presentations of the role that the SDI program was going to play in U.S. foreign policy and defense strategy.
Thank you. Before I turn to our second commentator, let me remind our viewers that you're welcome, in fact, encouraged to join the conversation this afternoon. Our preferred way for you to do so is to use the raise hand function in the Zoom functionality, and then we'll call on you in due course, and you can pose your question or comment directly to Aaron and our panel. Or alternatively, you can use, and some of you have been doing this, you can use the Q&A function in Zoom and put your question there, and then we'll try to put those to our panelists. Now it gives me real pleasure to introduce our second commentator, Dr. Anthony Eames. He's the Director of Scholarly Initiatives at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, where he oversees the development of academic alliances and is responsible for fellowships and programs to support scholarship on the Reagan presidency, legacy, and era. He holds a PhD in history from Georgetown University and an MA jointly conferred by Georgetown and King's College London. He's the author of A Voice in Their Own Destiny, Reagan, Thatcher, and Public Diplomacy in the Nuclear 1980s, published last year by the University of Massachusetts Press. And he's co-author with John Bayliss of Sharing Nuclear Secrets, Trust, Mistrust, and Ambiguity in Anglo-American Nuclear Relations, 1939 to the present, published also last year by Oxford University Press. He has spoken, published widely on nuclear national security issues in journals and other outlets, including the Journal of Military History, Technology and Culture, and War on the Rocks. In addition to his work at the Institute, he teaches for Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Anthony, wonderful to have you with us. The Zoom room is all yours.
Well, Christian, thanks for the introduction, and thanks to the AJ and the Wilson Center and the whole team for this kind of wonderful seminar. It's a real anchor for us professional historians. Aaron, Susie, always good to share a stage with you, or a Zoom panel, as it were. First off, general appreciation and compliments to Aaron. This is a really great book, and I was commending it to a colleague today, and I said this is the best book on SDI yet. And I sincerely mean that. And let me tell you why. Aaron brings SDI into focus in weapons of space, and it's received plenty of attention over the last 40 years from scholars and policymakers and whatnot, but rarely has it been approached with the same depth and insight and historical balance that Aaron's done here. And so let's kind of think about the two normal scripts that people read off when they think about SDI or talk about SDI, and then think about how Aaron departs from those scripts. The first script is Reagan dreamed of SDI first in the 1940s as an actor, and then later in the 60s and 70s as he got the briefings that made him think about mutual assured survival. And he brought it into the reality, and it was what scared the Soviets back to the negotiating table. SDI is what won the Cold War. It was technologically ambitious, but what technologies that redefine, orthodox security worldviews aren't technologically ambitious? That's kind of the first script. And the second script is Star Wars was a ludicrous pie in the sky plan for space lasers that spiraled the arms race out of control and was aimed at the peace movement, not the Soviet Union. Its impact is largely non-existent. Its legacy is largely non-existent on a strategic level. But its legacy is more existent on or extant on a cultural level as we think about follies of the strategic community. Neither of those scripts have it right, and I think Aaron comes closest to getting it right that we've seen so far. He doesn't fall into either of those extremes, and he breaks out of the U.S.-centric narrative that Susie commented a little bit about on SDI narratives, and he does that by really developing a rich archival base, a lot of SDI stories and histories that you'll read. You'll look at the archives and you'll see basically all US archives, maybe a British archive here, but Aaron, of course, also crossed the other side of the Iron Curtain and was able to get kind of accounts and perspectives from the Soviet side of things. And I think that's really made for a richer book and a book that breaks the mold. Aaron, one of the more novel aspects of your study is the attention to the reconnaissance dimension. So many SDI histories have focused on the program's potential to make either the peace movements or the peacemaker missiles obsolete. But you rightly draw attention to the long-term development of ASAP capabilities, anti-satellite weapons capabilities, and their impact on intelligence collection and surveillance and Five Eyes relationships. And this is no small task, given that the National Reconnaissance Organization or Office, an agency that was not even publicly known until after the Cold War, is an important character in the SDI origin story, and one that you shine a spotlight on in a way that I haven't really seen anyone else shine a spotlight on. And it brings to mind that there is something new under the sun when we uncover the ways that some little-known agencies play surprisingly major roles in big episodes of the Cold War, and it shows us kind of how to unsettle narratives about the Cold War. There are a lot of different bureaucratic entities, both in the United States and throughout Europe and in the Soviet Union, and sometimes looking for that one agency that we didn't think had a big impact, but actually does have a big impact, is a good way to change up the narrative and change up the arguments. So that's an example that's set, but also a good development of your study. Every so often, someone does something so obvious that you kind of have to scratch your head and think, why didn't I do that? Or why didn't I think of it this way? And Aaron's book very much does that, because he locates the origins of SDI not here on Earth in terrestrial sense, but actually in space. One of the ways he does that, of course, is from the satellite reconnaissance perspective we talked about, and in the civilian commercial dimension that he talks about with Reagan being kind of a space enthusiast. But the first is somewhat obvious, is he spells out the impact of SDI on the space side of the nuclear and space talks that were launched in 1985. If you look at other histories of the era, at the end of the Cold War, usually SDI's impact on arms control is figured in the kind of INF and START debates in history, but rarely, if ever, to my knowledge, on the space side. That's a really excellent contribution. And comparisons here are instructive. So for decades, nuclear arms control had given a common framing and criteria to those talks that emerged at the end of the Reagan years. But relatively limited discussions on space arms control. I mean, you have the Outer Space Treaty in '67 that Aaron references, had left a kind of a wide gap, prevented the emergence of a common epistemology on arms control on the space issues between the between Moscow and Washington that's really interesting, really fascinating stuff. Another thing is, SDI is almost exclusively told, the history of it almost exclusively told from the view of strategic nuclear balance, and not from the space competition front. And Aaron, again, you show SDI to be a boon for space commercialization, and it breaks apart that kind of long-held dichotomy of the militarization of space versus the kind of peaceful use or commercialization of space. And what you've done is you've really shown how those go hand in hand, that one doesn't happen without the other. And I want to dive back into that and kind of laying out some questions. But let me kind of finish up some comments before we get into the conversation. I'll say this: your epilogue is pretty splendid. It brought a smile to my face as I was wrapping up the book, particularly the comparison between the SDI rollout and the Space Force rollout. And it leads me to wonder if the success of NASA, for all of mankind and peaceful uses of outer space, and if that success has positioned Space Force and SDR public relations efforts to fail. Have we so much drank the Kool-Aid that space should only be used for peaceful uses, that any potential kind of strategic or military application is doomed to fail? And one might expect a kind of a formulation of the Monroe Doctrine, making space safe for international commerce, would be readily adapted, and yet it rarely seems employed. So I'll get into some questions, and hopefully you'll take up a few of them, and I'm sure the audience will have some great questions. First, very simple. What do you want the legacy of your book to be in kind of the academic literature? I mean, you talked about your historiographic intervention, but more specifically, what ripples do you want to see from the pages that you have here? And I guess I'll do what Susie does in terms of the buckets of questions. So keeping this first bucket of questions, militarization is a very elastic term. And the idea of providing information for military purposes, equating to militarization, might further expand how we think about militarization here on Earth, in various sectors or organizations. So I'd like you to think a little bit in this kind of Q&A about what militarization means and how your work on SDIs has made you think about this. Aaron, I know you trained as a historian of technology. In thinking about this ripples question, SDI in the context of the evolution of technological systems. Do you see, a graduate student reading Thomas Hughes and then reading Aaron Bateman and having a kind of a new perspective on that idea? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. And I'll move on to the next bucket of questions because I think that's enough kind of abstract.
Effie, why don't we have Aaron respond to these, and then you can launch your second bucket. I think that's easier for some of the for our viewers
Sure.
Follow some of the lead here. Aaron.
Yeah, well, thanks for those comments and questions, Anthony. So what do I want the legacy of the book to be? That's a pretty weighty question. One thing I would really like to see is more scholarship in the history of the space age that really looks into these more intimate connections between space technologies and alliance politics, space technologies and these broader shifts in US and Soviet and military strategies. I mean, these are kind of missing dimensions of the history. And what I always tell my students when I teach about this subject in the context of the Cold War is that if we think about the history of the space age like an iceberg, NASA and human space exploration, it's the visible part above the waterline, but there's all of this stuff below the waterline, and it's the billions of dollars that the United States and the Soviet Union spent on these other space activities. And in many ways, NASA was a convenient sideshow or a convenient distraction from these other activities. And SDI is just one part of that, but it's not just a US story. Other countries were involved, US allies were involved. And so really having an international history of this subject is only beginning. This is not the definitive or final work or the final word on that subject. What does militarization mean? This is a question that still is being grappled with by diplomats in the context of space, to say nothing of other technologies. And why this is a controversial question is there's long been a debate about militarization versus weaponization of space. And having looked at this issue in the context of the Cold War, my answer to you is that it's really in many ways an artificial distinction in the sense that those words mean different things to different audiences. But what's important for our purposes is that by the end of the Cold War, the United States was investing a substantial sum of money in deploying satellites in space that could enable all kinds of military actions, whether it's surveillance and reconnaissance, communications, navigation, enabling precision strikes against enemy forces. All those kinds of stuff was related to these investments that the United States and the Soviet Union, for that matter, are making in space. And while SDI would not come to fruition, while there wouldn't be hundreds or thousands of weapons deployed in space, both the US and the Soviet Union tested weapons in space, both nuclear and non-nuclear, during the Cold War. And so people can debate about whether or not space was weaponized, but that terminology aside, what I just stated is the historical reality. And then finally, about SDI and the evolution of technological systems, I would never be so confident as to put myself in the same league as Thomas Hughes. But I think that what SDI shows is that technological systems evolve for all kinds of reasons that are oftentimes political in nature. And so one of the points that I make in the book is that the actual technological concepts that were pursued by SDI system designers, the engineers designing SDI, were not just driven by technological imperative, but were also driven by political realities and political pressures. That Reagan said, I want a near-term defense. Well, if you're going to have a near-term defense in the next 5 or 10 years versus thinking about a 20-year timeline, that's going to substantially influence the kinds of technologies that you indeed pursue. And so I do think that SDI is an interesting case study for how do large-scale technological systems evolve within a very complex international political environment.
Thank you. Anthony, back to you.
Aaron, that's great. Okay, I'll go with 3 kind of quick fire questions here. The first, Reagan offers to share SDI with Gorbachev. And I think I've had this very conversation with you and Susie before in a different forum, but I think it led to interesting answers. Why didn't Gorbachev say yes? The second, your book meets Susie's book on the bookshelf. A little more about how the anti-nuclear opinions, peace movements, civil unrest shaped thinking about SDI. And then lastly, you note that SDI wasn't the technological Marshall Plan that it was promised to be. But yet, what are some of the concrete technological developments that came from SDI? Not really just on a military standpoint, but on the civilian standpoint, which was largely what was promised to the Allies. And maybe what about the kind of remaking of the defense innovation pace, the procurement bureaucracy, things of those nature, as a legacy of SDI?
Okay, so why didn't Gorbachev say yes to sharing SDI? He famously said to Reagan, you don't even share farm production, agricultural equipment with the Soviet Union. Why would you share this highly classified technology? Which is in effect what Reagan's advisors said to him, that we have no way of doing this. How would we share SDI technologies with the Soviets? And Margaret Thatcher said that the very idea of it was insane. So Gorbachev didn't say yes to sharing SDI for a number of reasons. One was he didn't actually believe it was really sincere. But 2, there was really no substantive mechanism for doing this on the scale that Reagan had envisioned. However, moving into the 90s, kind of growing out of this expansive idea of sharing SDI, the US and Russia did talk about sharing some missile early warning data moving into the Bush 41 and Clinton years. So not sharing missile defense technologies, but coming up with risk reduction measures that in some way, shape, or form were related to these ideas that Reagan espoused. The anti-nuclear peace movement, I think that one of the things that comes out of SDI and the story of SDI in an international context is that there was a significant moral dimension to the debate. And in the book, I talk about how Reagan tried to get Pope John Paul II to endorse SDI. The Soviets tried to get John Paul II to condemn SDI. And the idea is that, well, we, the United States, we, the Reagan administration, should get people to believe and should get people to understand from our perspective that this is a more moral defense than relying on the threat of nuclear annihilation. But that doesn't really take root. And a lot of the peace activists do believe that SDI is just another avenue of the arms race, that it's going to lead to greater instability. And so while there are people, according to polls, many people in the United States who like the idea of having a defense against missiles coming into the US, coming in to attack the US, polls also show that overwhelmingly people are uncomfortable with the idea of deploying weapons in space. So there's a real inherent tension between these two things. Concrete technological developments that came from SDI. One could probably do an expansive study on this, although it's very difficult to actually disentangle what specifically came from SDI research and development. Were there spinoffs? I think the key things that did come out of it in a tangible material sense were better information networks. Most of this did have a military application, both civilian and military, but was more thrusted into a military application kind of context. But information networks, more advanced sensors, smaller satellites, if we think about the small satellite revolution that we see today, a lot of those concepts were championed by the Strategic Defense Initiative Organization. When we see commercial space technologies today that are blossoming, some of those concepts came from SDIO. And so we do see tangible connections in the space arena. And then in terms of the procurement bureaucracy, SDI gave the Department of Defense a model for how to have a small organization do acquisition much more efficiently than larger scale DoD organizations in the context of the late Cold War. But that hasn't really, in general, been a replicable model at scale. And so I would say, even though there is an organization within the DoD today trying to replicate the Strategic Defense Initiative Organization, in general, these were fairly unique circumstances within the context of the 1980s and early 90s.
Great. Anthony, any further questions on your part?
I think it's a good time to open it to the floor. Yep.
Great. Thank you so much for your questions. Let me, I think both of us, Eric and I, have a question. Let me perhaps start, Aaron. We're at the Washington History Seminar. I think in this day and age, it's always important to remind people we don't make this stuff up. It's based on archives and documents. Talk for a moment about the source base for your book, and perhaps let us in on sort of one thrilling find. You already alluded to one of them, but perhaps there are others. And then what are still kind of the gaps in the source space that we're facing, and that future research on SDI can hopefully address?
No, it's a really good question. So the journey for this book went through kind of a winding path, because when I started out, I was really disappointed when I found out from the Reagan Presidential Library that they're about a decade behind on declassification review. And there had been quite a lot declassified, but not really a lot about the intense policy discussions over what are the goals of SDI and how are we going to achieve them. And some of the more technological dimensions of SDI, a lot of the material was not available. But I started to look at the allies and partners piece, And fortunately for me, I discovered at the UK National Archives that the United States had shared an enormous number of documents with the British, documents that were not available in the United States, but had been declassified by the British government. And so I was able to really use the UK National Archives as a backdoor, somewhat unexpectedly, into the SDI program. So I'll highlight two things that I found that were really, really interesting. One, there was a set of documents that really showed that the US government was considering the offensive applications of SDI, while publicly the US was saying, we're not really considering that at all. I don't necessarily see that as shocking because acknowledging this would have created a public diplomacy issue. But nonetheless, I found that really interesting. I'll actually highlight three things. The second one was travel reports from Vatican City, where the US SDI representatives were basically going to the Vatican trying to get John Paul II on board with SDI. And the US ambassador in Vatican City sends a cable back and says, please stop sending these SDI salesmen. It's really upsetting the Pope's advisors. The Pope is not going to endorse SDI. And then the final one was from the British National Archives. There were a series of documents that showed that by 1990, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's views on SDI had really significantly transformed. There's still this narrative that Thatcher was generally opposed to SDI, but what we find is that by 1990, she was saying to George H.W. Bush, I hope that you will maintain the momentum of SDI. It's absolutely imperative that this program moves forward. And so for a number of reasons, and primarily due to her relationship with the head of the SDI program, the Prime Minister's view to her perspectives on the program had significantly evolved, and she was one of the few foreign supporters of SDI. In terms of research in this area, there's still a lot more to unpack from the Soviet angle. I only was really able to get bits and pieces from the collections that are available. And then there's a lot more to look at outside of the transatlantic alliance. I would say Japan and Israel in particular. There's a lot of potentially interesting avenues for research.
Thank you. And I should emphasize that Anthony is leading an effort at the Reagan Institute to collect and open up many more of these sources. Over to Eric. Your question, Eric.
A very quick question from a non-specialist. The issue of delinkage between SDI and the INF negotiations that Gorbachev arrives at. You note at the end of the book that Gorbachev is in part motivated by what he learns from his scientific team about potential Soviet countermeasures, anti-satellite weapons that can basically render anything that the United States puts in the sky inoperable. Why did it take so long to figure that out? And is this the vulnerability all along to Reagan's plan about space-based weapons?
Yeah, so in part, why it takes so long is because it's not really until that decoupling point that the US government is even saying, this is what we're going to pursue. And it's actually clear to the Soviets, okay, this is what the Americans plan to procure and deploy in the 1990s. And so this is what a potential response would look like. Prior to that, it was just widespread speculation. And so that's really one important piece. And there had been a series of studies going on in the Soviet Union within the Ministry of Defense about what kind of countermeasures could indeed be produced. And so I would say there was a convergence of factors. But I think that a really important one is greater clarity about what US plans were actually looking like and what could materialize conceivably or realistically.
Great, thank you. All right, let's turn it over to our viewers. Join this conversation by using the raise hand function, and you'll be queued, and we'll be calling on you shortly. Or post your comment to the Q&A. We'll try to get to those as well. We'll start with Michael Binder. If you could please unmute yourself, Michael.
Thanks, Christian. Two questions quickly. What did Western Europe think of a system that would defend the United States against ICBMs, but seems to have little to promise in the way of battlefield support weapons, of which there were more numerous, and which would have decimated Europe? And secondly, would SDI have come about without Edward Teller?
Okay, so initially, Europeans said SDI is a Fortress America kind of approach, that the US is, Reagan in effect envisions having a protective shield around America, leaving Europe exposed. And the US responds to that. Reagan's response was, well, SDI is also going to protect Europe. But there was still widespread concern that this could actually leave Europe in a more vulnerable position. And I'm sorry, what was the second question?
He's no longer on the
Okay.
call there.
Sorry, Edward Teller's role?
Oh, Edward Teller, yes. So Edward Teller's role, I think it's really overplayed. By the time Reagan decides to include these lines in that March 83 speech, he had met with Teller around the same time. But the concepts that Teller was pushing were not in any way, shape, or form welcomed by the White House. I see Daniel Graham, members of the high frontier crowd who were promoting missile defense were much more consequential for the specific kinds of missile defense technologies that the US would pursue. So Teller wasn't in any way, shape, or form the godfather of SDI, and he even acknowledged that later on in life.
Thank you. Susie, Anthony, feel free to chime in at whatever point you'd like. Let me call on Steve Brady next. Steve, please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Terrific session. I appreciate it. Great book, Aaron. You raised a second question here, but I'll stick with my first, which will be very short. So as like Eric, a non-technology, non-weapon system specialist, just a broader question about historiography, which is where would you put your book as far as an intervention in the broader issue of Reagan, the historiography of Reagan's foreign policy? How, in what way does it impact our understanding of his policy, his foreign policy more broadly?
Yeah, so I think there's two areas that I would really point out. One is there's more scholarship coming out on what was the nature of Reagan's military buildup. And there's this idea that Reagan was continuing a lot of programs that Jimmy Carter's administration had put into place, in some cases expanding upon them, in some cases introducing new ones. And so I think that when you look at SDI from the vantage point that I have, it does show that there's elements of truth in both of those different arguments, that there are aspects of SDI that are technologically connected to the Carter administration and the Ford administration, but the scale of it was much, much larger than anything that had been conceived prior. So there's the Reagan defense strategy piece. The other is looking at Reagan's foreign policy towards allies, and Susie's book, of course, is a really key part of this historiography as well. And it's how did the Reagan administration manage its relationships with key allies in a really delicate period in the Cold War. And I think that what we find with SDI is the United States trying to use technological inducements to get the allies on board, that's really the carrot. And then we find that US export controls are oftentimes undermining these expansive promises that the United States is making, or even if they're not promises, alluding to the possibility of getting a lot more technological benefits than was really even possible given US export controls. So that really at times creates even more tension in US relations with its allies. And so I see those as really two key historiographical interventions, specifically in the context of the Reagan presidency.
Thank you, Aaron. James Ferguson, you're next. Please unmute yourself. There you go.
I'm just wondering, and I haven't had a chance to pick up the book and read it yet. And I'm just wondering, in terms of, as a Canadian, the Canadian dimension of this. A lot of times, studies done from the American perspective with our allies look to the Europeans, the UK, NATO, etc. But they tend to ignore us in Canada. And this was a major issue in Canada, particularly as affected the North American Aerospace Defense Command. So I wonder if you could make some comments or fill me in what you've talked about in terms of the Canadian dimension of this.
Thank you.
So I just some brief comments, and I believe that Susie has looked at this issue as well and might even have more to say than I do about Canada's involvement in SDI. But what I will say is that Canadian firms become involved, but Canada does not formally become involved in SDI. It doesn't sign a memorandum of understanding. And multiple US allies would take this approach that basically the Canadian government, the French government don't want to be seen as endorsing this expansive vision that Reagan has for SDI, but aren't going to prevent Canadian or French companies from participating. But there is concern that with Canadian involvement in NORAD, that somehow Canada could become complicit in the operation of an SDI system. And this becomes an issue that has to be delicately navigated. And one of the things that we find is with numerous US allies, US facilities in their countries become a source of controversy due to a perception that they might have some connection to SDI. This also happens in Australia with the so-called joint facilities in Alice Springs and near Woomera. There's this perception that maybe there could be some secret connection with SDI and that Australia could be drawn into this SDI program. So Canada doesn't have the same level of participation, but I think what we see in the Canadian case and in other cases of US allies, both in NATO and external to NATO, is widespread concern about even being seen as tacitly endorsing Reagan's vision for SDI that could have really negative implications from their perspective for strategic stability.
Thank you. Let's turn to James Janista. Go ahead. We can't hear you. We still can't hear you, though it looks like you're unmuted at our end, so you're muted again now. Let's please try to unmute yourself. Go ahead now. No. Maybe we'll try to come back to you. Let me bring in a question posed by Hiroaki Nakanishi. Actually, two questions. He asks, may I know more on the laser tech side of SDI? How much did the US share the tech with its allies? How much did the discussion on arms control on laser, how did the discussion on arms control on laser go? And then he follows up, how could the US promote a new SDI using a maritime-based laser tech rather than, for example, the laser Aegis system? Did Reagan think of a space-based laser defense only, or equally think on land or sea-based laser defense systems? Is there any joint collaboration among allies of such laser defense systems? So, Aaron, over to you.
Okay, so what I'll just say, the kind of short answer is that Reagan did not have any commitment to any particular technological concepts. He was not really a technologically savvy guy. And that becomes very clear when you look through declassified NSC meeting minutes. He basically says, you technical experts, you'll figure it out. So what becomes clear fairly quickly is that lasers are really futuristic technologies that are not going to be able to be fielded by the end of the 20th century for missile defense. In terms of research with allies, there are allies who are involved in research and development projects that do contain things like advanced optics that could have laser applications. But in general, the United States is not sharing ongoing laser research and development efforts within the Department of Defense with its key allies because the technologies are so sensitive.
Aaron, I'll hop in because I think there was a question about if there was research on laser tech outside of space. And the answer is there was some research done on land-based lasers, which have all sorts of geographical issues. You basically have to find a very high altitude, mountaintops, whatnot. And there was kind of a search for different appropriate geographies and mountain ranges and whatnot that a potential system could be cited at. Aaron, I'm sure you know a little more about that than I do, though.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, lasers were tested. There was a famous experiment involving the space shuttle where a land-based laser was fired off into space, and they were trying to get the pointing mechanism down. But in general, lasers of a power necessary to shoot down incoming ballistic missiles were just not feasible at the time, and even today, still an exceptionally difficult technical challenge.
Thank you. Let's go to Hope Harrison. Hope, please unmute yourself. And then we'll try James Janista again. Hope.
Thank you. And thanks, Aaron, for a wonderful talk and a wonderful book. I want to go back to one of the questions Susie asked, the big question, which has come up a little bit, but, I just would love to see you sort of hammer the nail on the head of how your book fits into the broader Cold War historiography, and particularly the end of the Cold War, because there's so many things people say about Reagan and so many things, they argue about SDI, but if you can just sort of give the elevator speech, if you will, as to what your research contributes to this big question so many people keep asking about the end of the Cold War and, what role Reagan played. Thanks.
Yeah, no, really, really good question. I would say that one of the things that my research shows, and I'm not the only person who's looked at this, I think Elizabeth Charles's dissertation on this subject is one of the best things out there on SDI in the end of the Cold War. And I really build on a lot of the research that she has done. And I really concur with a lot of her main conclusions, and that is that SDI was not a part of some integrated strategy to bring down the Soviet Union. That does not mean that there were not competitive aspects to SDI. There were. The Reagan administration at times talked about SDI being a pressure point on the Soviets, both with arms control specifically, on the Soviet economy more broadly. But I think the really important thing is that even though the CIA was saying to the White House, the Soviets are making some investments to counter SDI, the Soviets weren't trying to build an SDI equivalent. So there's no evidence for the idea that SDI spent the Soviets out of existence. I think that is really a mythical characterization. The other thing is you don't see an integrated strategy in which SDI is the centerpiece to bring down the USSR. Certainly, Reagan did pursue a competitive strategy in certain arenas, but we also see with this greater wave of historiography in the last 10 years that Reagan, sincerely going back to his first administration, wanted to reach out to the Soviets and make progress in arms control. And with SDI specifically, even though Reagan was intransigent on SDI, it wasn't because he wanted arms control to fail. Rather, he saw SDI as the insurance policy for these other arms control agreements. So I think it also adds more nuance to our understanding of what was Reagan's perspective on arms control and what did he actually want to achieve. And even though the space component of the nuclear and space talks was a failure, in no way, shape, or form does that undermine this these historiographical interventions in recent years that underline the sincerity of Reagan's commitment to arms control.
Thank you very much. Let's try James Janista again. James, if you could please unmute yourself. It looks like you're unmuted, but for some reason we can't hear you. I'm sorry about that. Let's go to Sergey Shuk. Sergey?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question about Soviet reaction to SDI, because in my findings in Ukrainian archives, KGB archives, I have this collection of special reports from KGB agents in US who used mostly open sources, to discredit this program and to present Reagan policy as a threat to Soviet Union. And eventually, these KGB attacks on Reagan used SDI, and again, an exaggerated SDI effect, to portray Americans as major enemy. And until 1985, according to these reports, KGB was against any collaboration with Americans. And the major point was this information from 1983 SDI. So I just recommend you to use these documents. You can go to website of this archive and ask question about these documents in English. And people from archive, if you mention this font 16, 1983, they will be ready to send you photocopies of these documents. It will be very important to show this another effect, this reaction to Reagan's Star Wars program in Soviet Union.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and I'll just add that the Lithuanian Special Archives, there was a collection of KGB documents that also provide some insight into KGB perspectives on SDI in the late 80s up until about 1990. And what you do see in those documents as well is less alarmism. There's not quite as much alarmism as there was in 1983 and 1985. In part for the reasons that I stated in response to Eric Arneson's question, that as the Soviets have a clearer idea of what this means, there's greater confidence that the Soviets could deal with it. That doesn't mean that there was zero concern by that point, but there is this idea that this is a manageable problem if it materializes.
Thank you. We're coming towards the end of our discussion here. Let me perhaps ask one question that David Sobelson poses. Doesn't Israel's Iron Dome defense show that, with its fault, the Strategic Defense Initiative had the right idea that missile defense can work and provide substantial protection?
So the big difference there is that Iron Dome is what would be called a feeder missile defense system. SDI was really dedicated to developing what's known as national missile defense. It's much harder to shoot down incoming ICBMs than it is to go after shorter range missile threats. So missile defense is a very expansive term, but comparing Israel's Iron Dome or Arrow system to the US ground-based interceptor, for example, that in testing only works about 50% of the time against ICBM threats. It's a bit of an apples and oranges comparison. Both missile defense technologies, but going after different threats, different levels of complexity.
We could go on for quite a while, lots more questions in the Q&A, but we have to bring this to a close. Aaron, Susie, Anthony, thanks for a really wonderful discussion. Let me turn it over to Eric for some concluding words.
And my thanks as well to our participants and those of you in the audience who joined us today. Let me remind you that we return next Monday for an American Historical Association-sponsored session on She Changed the Nation, Barbara Jordan's Life and Legacy in Black Politics by American University historian Mary Ellen Curtin. We hope you can join us. Till then, take care, everyone. Good night.